Hello everybody. Welcome to this roundtable about research in gaming. We have two lovely people here today who will be discussing their work, Hamish and Kate. And before we get started, as I usually do, I just want to do a quick land acknowledgement. Since I'm the host and I'm considering us virtually meeting on the lands in Winnipeg, Canada, I just want to say that we are gathered today on the ancestral lands, Treaty 1 territory and traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, Dene peoples, and Dene peoples, and on the traditional homeland of the Métis Nation. Acknowledging this truth is important, but it is only a small part in cultivating strong relationships with Indigenous communities and helping them to heal. So thank you for that. And now, just to get started, I wanted to ask each of our participants here if they would be willing to introduce themselves, just very briefly, their experience with research in gaming, and if they wouldn't mind mentioning what their favorite game of 2021 is. Let's start with Kate.
Sure, thanks very much, Natalie. So hi everyone, I am Kate. I'm a teaching fellow in classics at Durham University, and I research two main areas. One is gender and language, I suppose, kind of broadly in Greek tragedy, and the other one is gender in games, so in kind of classical reception games particularly, so there's a bit of an overlap in my research interests there. My favourite game of 2021, I played a lot of Hades, but I think actually it was ever so slightly pipped to the post because I also played Divinity Original Sin 2 in 2021. I know it wasn't a game of 2021, but that's when I got to it, and I thought that was absolutely brilliant, actually. So I think that just slightly is going to win it for me.
I don't blame you for that. Yeah, that's an excellent game. And Hamish.
Hey everyone, I'm Hamish Cameron. I am a lecturer at Victoria University of Wellington down in New Zealand. I work on Roman imperialism, the Roman Near East, classical geography, and the reception of the ancient world, mostly the Roman world, but all parts of it really, in games, both analog and digital actually. My favorite game of 2021, I still haven't been able to decide, even though you generously narrowed it to 1 year. I might just go with The Forgotten City, because a game that fits into a neat, like, kind of 8-hour slot and is a very good introduction to classics has to be pretty high in my rankings, and I don't want to give it to AC Valhalla, which I do enjoy, but I think it gets enough, you know, Ubisoft doesn't need my help. You should play The Forgotten City.
I think that's fair, yes. And The Forgotten City is awesome. Yeah.
Yeah, it's very good.
So for this discussion, I do have some questions that I'm just going to pose to you two if you wouldn't mind answering. But of course, this being a roundtable, any of you who are visiting here in the audience, if you have any questions, please raise your hand at any time. I'll let you speak. Or you can, of course, message your question to me in the chat, and then I can read it out for our people. So my first question for you two is fairly generic, and it's really, what do you see as being unique to research in gaming? Are there any specific challenges that are unique to that medium? And what, I guess, unique approaches might you take just based on the medium itself? Do either of you want to jump in first?
Sure, I can start. Someone has to, I guess. Yeah, I think it's an interesting question, because partly it depends what sorts of games you're looking at, because some of the techniques we already know about from research in classical reception more broadly do apply quite well to some aspects of games. So people who research kind of films and TV and so on are perfectly fine with describing what effectively we get as cutscenes in games, you know, a scene where characters are talking and you can describe the dialogue and the visual setup and so on, and that's sort of the same. And for my own recent research, I looked at a mobile game which is kind of story driven. So for that, I could do almost all of my analysis by effectively analyzing the dialogue, because there wasn't very much else. When it comes to other types of games, though, and sort of what aspects, things like mechanics and so on, then I think you start to have more unique challenges, and particularly those unique challenges come about because our audiences are sometimes less familiar with games. So, you know, the people who are at this panel are probably mostly people who are already interested in games in one form or another, but quite a lot of the sort of wider classics community for whom we're also writing may not have played something. So if you start talking about complex game mechanics, particularly in a fixed form of writing, it can be quite difficult to work out how can I describe this or show it in a way that's suiting the kind of published form and that's getting across enough information for people who don't necessarily know this format. So I think that's a sort of unique challenge that we're learning to approach, and particularly our students are learning to approach as well in things like undergraduate dissertations at the moment.
No, absolutely. I think those are all really good points. Sorry, no, I recently wrote, one thing I was wondering as you were just talking is if you have any thoughts on just the fact that, I mean, comparing video games to film and television, I mean, maybe television not so much, but some games certainly are just, I mean, days long, and have massive plots, and having to condense that for people who haven't played a game at all is quite a bit of a challenge as well. Sorry, Hamish, if you want to jump in as well, please go right ahead.
No, that's a great segue actually, because I think that TV is a good example there. Like Buffy, for example, has 144 episodes.
Yeah.
If you want people to really understand what's going on in Buffy, they probably have to watch most of those. Similarly, if you want to understand what's really going on in Assassin's Creed Odyssey, you probably have to spend about 100 hours or so, maybe even more, to play through all of everything and get a sense of the things that are going on. That degree of interactivity is one of the challenges of games, I think, especially with the big open world games that are the way that AAA developers are tending to go now, where there's just so much. And the order that you experience in it, and the way that the narrative emerges from that is going to be so individual and based on your own playthrough that it makes it a tricky challenge to describe exactly what you did and what experience that was and how that relates to your analysis in a game like that. In a game like, even the Forgotten City, you're still doing things in different orders. You might not talk to somebody. I didn't discover the Roman latrine until after the stream. I was like, I never went down that alleyway. I guess I'll go back to the alleyway. And that's a very small environment. So that sort of non-linear nature with a lot of games, as Kate said, like there is a certain degree of linearness and movie-like quality to it that is a little bit easier if you're used to talking to an audience that's familiar with film analysis. But the way that it can branch and go in different directions can be a challenge as well. Yeah.
That's actually something I've been wondering about a lot lately in terms of research on video games. And I think perhaps this shows my own bias. I do really enjoy RPGs. And of course, in that you often have a lot of character choice in terms of how your character behaves, how your character interacts with others. And even games like, Disco Elysium, which Kira Jones did a wonderful paper on in November, in terms of Oedipus, pardon me. And of course, her playthrough, she was playing through as an Oedipus character, but you don't need to play that character that way. So I'm wondering how you see, or how, if you two can speak to how you address that interactivity, that player-defined element of games in your research.
Yeah, I think that's actually, Hamish was really right to kind of bring that out as one of the particular challenges, because even in sort of small, quite limited games, so the game I've worked on that I mentioned already is, it's a mobile game. It doesn't take that long to play through, and there's a lot of people playing it on YouTube and so on. So sometimes you can get around kind of interactivity on the practical side by just hoping that someone else has made the choice differently, and then you can do things like invoke YouTube videos or whatever, and you can sort of get around it that way. But if not, sometimes you have to, and I did have to. I found a choice where I was aware that you could make a choice to trigger a particular scene. I hadn't managed to take any screenshots of it for myself, so I couldn't get exactly the right dialogue. I couldn't find anyone on the internet who'd played it and made this choice, because it was a really unpopular set of decisions that most of the players didn't want to make. And so I had to replay the game myself. I mean, I'd already played it something like 8 full times and had to replay it again, at which point I was getting really sick of this thing, just in order to to generate the right dialogue in order to quote it. And I was thinking as I was doing it, practically this is so different to watching a TV series or, reading a novel, which is another kind of reception work I sometimes do, where you could just open the page and it's always going to be the same, and it's not going to be kind of hiding part of the dialogue from you. So you can always kind of research it. And I think I think that's going to get easier the more we do it, and particularly things like YouTube playthroughs or the sort of streams you guys have been doing at this conference, or people like Save Antiquity Studies have been doing. All of these kind of live streaming of and recordings of games. The more that proliferates across the internet, effectively, the easier some of this stuff is going to get, because so many more of these options are going to be recorded somewhere. So you can sort of rely on those rather than necessarily having to generate everything yourself. But for the moment, I think we have to admit that and kind of almost accept that if we are going to be doing this sort of work, we may have to put in extra time in order to generate these things until that is kind of available everywhere. And with less popular games or less popular choices, that is kind of something I think we have to be aware of.
I think that's a great point. Yeah, absolutely. Hamish, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, another thing that's really useful, as well as playthroughs and streams and the like, which are invaluable, is wikis for bigger games. Like if you're doing any work on an Assassin's Creed game, just about all the dialogue for every game is available online, and you can go and find it and find out what the dialogue is for various choices. And this doesn't replace playing the game, obviously, or watching a playthrough, but it's another way that you can look and see. Another resource you can use to pull quotes from and to reference as well. I should have mentioned, actually, in talking about the specific challenges, that thinking about analog games, this is even more of an issue when there isn't a set narrative. Often there are mechanics and there is a setting, and then the rest entirely happens where you cannot see it in somebody's home for most of the time, for like a board game or a role-playing game. And there you just have to sort of explicitly note your own experience is what you're talking about or where you're getting it from, but then just disclaim that you can't talk about it specifically in some ways. And I think that maintaining that sort of like awareness and that voice to the audience that some of this stuff is subjective, and these are the ways in which it is subjective, and these are the things that you have specifically seen, and these are the things that you might not have, is one of the things that you have to keep in mind and do as you're working on it, I think.
Absolutely. And this is just a follow-up to that about analog games, Hamish, because I'm also a big fan of analog games. And one thing that I sometimes think about is, I mean, in our discipline, so much of our work, we have to provide evidence. And in a situation like that, which is experiential, which is rarely on film or recorded in any way, how do you appropriately cite these things or record them for research purposes? Do you have any thoughts on that? Or, I mean, it's a very big question, I realize that, but do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I realize that I probably should define these terms, right? I think probably most of the people in the audience are aware, but I use analog games like in contrast to digital games. So tabletop games, LARPs, mega games, board games, any of those would fit under the analog game space. Yeah, I don't. I just I deal with mechanics, I deal with setting if I'm talking about a role-playing game, say, and I don't try to get into the play space, because I think the play space is more like it's a thing you can talk about in the abstract and theorize about, but it's so specific, and it gets into the realm of player surveys and anthropology and ethnography and all that sort of stuff. And there is plenty of work around on that, which I can cite to talk about. So in terms of thinking about reception, I'm usually looking at what is in the D&D book about the ancient world, and what does the game say that you should be doing. And I can't cover what people are actually doing with it at the table.
Right,
unless somebody else has already covered that, who's more expert at those particular research techniques that I just frankly am not particularly interested in going into.
Yeah, no, that's totally fair. I mean, yeah. We do have a few questions in the chat. So I'm just going to start with one from Alison Poe. She says, it sounds to a non-gaming expert as if the concept of emergent narrative that Eduardo Garcia Molina used in his paper is relevant to the subject of what makes video gaming research unique and challenging. Do you two want to speak to that? or challenge it? Kate?
I'm afraid I couldn't make the paper.
Oh.
As you can see by the fact that I'm currently in darkness, the time zones are difficult for me for this conference. So if someone could give a little bit more information about the discussion, I'd be very happy to. Perhaps Hamish could start with this one.
Yeah, I can start with this one. I actually had written this down because emergent narrative is a term that, or a way of thinking about games that I use a lot and is used a lot in game studies, where it's, I mean, the distinction I usually draw is between scripted narrative, the narrative that the game explicitly gives you through the way that it organizes material, and particularly in an open world, emergent narrative is the way that you just make your own stories by the things that you do. So I gave a paper at ASCS in Australasia a couple of years ago, and in preparing for the paper, I logged into Odyssey and I took a bunch of screenshots. And at one point, I took a screenshot of a bandit camp from a top-down view, because I was looking at space and militarization. And then I left the game and I went and wrote the bit and I put the screenshot in, and when it came back, I was dead. And so there was this emergent narrative, right, that Cassandra had climbed up to this tower to look down onto the bandit camp and then had been randomly killed by bandits. And that's the kind of thing that's not part of the game. The game doesn't assume that you're going to randomly die in ignominious ways and ignominious ways, and it's going to fundamentally affect the story. But it becomes part of my narrative for the game, and a very memorable thing about the game, right? The time that you get into the stupid trouble and then it takes you a while to get out of it, but makes a good story later. That's essentially the emergent narrative thing. And that is absolutely such a critical part of the interactivity of games, and is absolutely part of what makes it difficult to, it's challenging to talk about, and something that you have to consider when you're writing.
I have to say that's one thing that I really, again, this is, I mean, I have a Zelda tattoo, so we know where my heart lies. But what I really love about the Zelda canon, when they put together like their official timelines for this huge series of games, they had one specific timeline for any time the protagonist dies. And I just liked that because it did sort of leave the narrative of it so open to the fact that, as you say, I mean, things happen outside of the expected plot all the time in gaming. Anyway, sorry, Kate, did you want to speak to that now that you may understand a little bit more what the question was?
Yeah, sure. Oddly, I have a very similar story to Hamish's in my own work. I was also giving a talk on Assassin's Creed, and I was thinking about the possibility of games for representing lived-in space in a way that kind of other sources of other things may not necessarily do, and particularly the ways that those can be useful for envisaging 3D space for kind of teaching and so on. And I was trying to take some pictures of one of the altars where there are kind of priests and kind of people praying around it in the center of Athens, right up at the top on the Acropolis. And somehow I upset somebody in the process of I think I shoved someone one too many times in the process of trying to take this picture, and it ended up in mass slaughter mostly around this altar, and I had to load the game in order to retake the photos, because what I was not trying to photograph was me slaughtering my way through Athens as a representative of living in Athens and kind of experiencing religious activity in Athens for my students. So yeah, those things kind of really arise a lot, and I think it's quite interesting. You mentioned kind of Hamish, the not trying to enter the playing space for analog games, and kind of that being sort of quite anthropological in some ways. And it's quite interesting that for video games, I think in some ways we have to be a bit careful of this, because anthropologists should not be observing a space and killing their way through it. And then, you know, there is a much more kind of interactive perspective from where we are, from us as researchers here, which I think these ideas of these emergent narratives and the changes that are happening while we're sort of doing the research process is something almost to be a bit cautious of. I mean, it doesn't really matter in the same way as, you know, because we're not observing video game people as if they were video game people, as if they were, real people. We are kind of aware that they are fake people. It's a fake setup. It is different to anthropological research, but nonetheless, I do think that's a kind of an interesting difference in some ways.
Absolutely.
Yeah, in games you can always reload or replay the game to get to a clean slate where you haven't killed all of those people and the mercenaries are not after you or whatever.
Yeah, no, that's a really interesting point. I feel like there's far more discussion about that, but I can't think of a really good follow-up question off the top of my head. Sorry, Kate. So I'm going to jump to another question from the chat. This is from Alexander. And he asks, how do you account for your own playstyle choices, customization, influence, etc., while reporting your analysis results in an academic text? Which efforts should researchers undertake to try to be transparent about their version or actualization of the text? And I think, again, I mean, this ties into what you were saying about analog gaming, Hamish, but Kate, do you want to start off on this question?
Sure. I mean, I think in some ways, this is something which we have been practicing doing for a little while in classics whenever we do reception studies and you know, more generally, whenever we do kind of theory influenced work. A lot of us have got used to the idea that we're all reading from whatever we're reading from a position. And so this is sort of true when we're interacting with games as well. We're playing from a position and our research is kind of impacted by that. And so I think particularly, I mean, I would always encourage sort of students and other people to be aware of things like reception theory when they start off on any project like this, because I think it does give us some of the tools to deal with that. But then I think the other way to kind of account for that is to try and make sure that I am being aware of other people's experiences and things like the kind of things I've mentioned already, like YouTube playthroughs or kind of streams or, you know, Reddit forums or everything else that gives you access to other players' experiences is an important part here, so that you can say explicitly, you know, in your work, so this is the position I took when I was doing this game, but here are some other possible positions, here are some other experiences, you know, I objected to this because I was coming at this from whatever it might be, from a feminist perspective. However, many players on this Reddit forum thought this was totally fine. I think, you know, kind of being aware of these other perspectives is an important part here, and not trying to represent ourselves as totally objective, which I think many of us, as I say, don't do necessarily in classical research anyway. We're all much more aware of our own perspectives than we used to be. But just being really explicit about that, I think, is quite a good way of dealing with this situation.
I think that's a great point. I mean, specifically with work like this, where your own perspective and knowledge sites so directly influences the text's response to you. I mean, it does everywhere, as you so well put, Kate. Recognizing our epistemological positions is especially important. Anyways, Hamish, sorry.
Yeah, I don't think I have very much to add to that. Certainly not from a theoretical perspective. I think Kate put it really well, talking about our positionality and how we acknowledge it. I think from a practical perspective, what I do when I'm thinking about analyzing a game is I'll usually play through the whole game, and depending on the size of it, multiple times maybe, but generally the games I've been looking at are quite large, so I play through it once and I take notes, and I mostly like remember parts that are interesting and I might want to talk about. And then when it comes to actually writing about what I'm going to write about, I then go and look at YouTube videos and playthroughs so that I have my own experience of what happened. But then when I'm actually looking at it, I'm looking at other people's experiences. And with bigger games, there tend to be a lot of examples of these. And so I'm looking around trying to find the one that does the thing I want it to do, or the one that has the right screenshot that I want to take from somebody else's video or something, or whatever I'm looking for. And in that process, I end up seeing a bunch of different options and a bunch of different ways that people talk about it, or go about playing through a game. And I think just from a practical perspective, that sort of forces me to think about the positionality and to think about how I'm going to write about that as I incorporate it into my research.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really great point. And yeah, sorry, that's a really great point. Yeah, I'm just going to jump now to Chuck Otten, who had his hand up about 5 minutes ago, if that's all right. Chuck, if you want to unmute yourself, you are welcome to ask your question.
Yeah, thank you. I was thinking about the question about how to sort of deal with some of these things with analog games, like especially board games and RPGs and stuff, and ways to sort of capture players' experiences and the interactivity. And one thing I've been contemplating doing, because there's a lot of ancient themed board games that I want to get into, you know, for research. There's just so many out there. And one of the things I've been contemplating doing is we've got a bunch of students that love board games, and just basically organizing play sessions and, you know, having something set up that's almost like the way that board game designers do with playtesting, where you have like a playtesting journal where there's just a questionnaire you ask them afterwards to try to capture some of that experience. You know, because in board games, like Kate was mentioning, that sometimes with all kinds of gaming, getting into the mechanics can be difficult, a difficult thing to sort of capture and describe using the methodologies and the language we're used to using to analyze text and images and stuff. And it gets harder sometimes. Like one of the things I'm contemplating doing with this is when you have a legacy style board game or a campaign style board game that goes across so many sessions. There's one that I'm actually contemplating doing next semester with a few students that's called Oath, that was designed by a PhD in history, and it was meant to mimic the mechanics of historiography. Each game session is essentially one generation. And then the next time you play, things that happened in that game impact the next game, and you're playing like the next generation, looking back on the history of this world that you're creating together. So that would require doing multiple sessions, ideally with the same people. But the designer even made a journal to go along with that game so that you can kind of try to capture your experience. So I'm contemplating doing that with students. So I was wondering if anybody's got any experience with that or thought about that, or has any thoughts or suggestions that might help in that regard. But that's just something I'm contemplating doing to try to capture this interactivity and gameplay experience in the analog world.
So thank you, first of all, for reminding me that I need to fill out my Playgroups journal of our last Oath game, because I haven't yet. Yeah, I think that's where it gets into that sort of survey stuff, as you said, but also if you have people writing like after action reports or reports of play in public spaces that you can draw on, that's where I would be looking for that sort of thing. But this is exactly the kind of thing that I usually, in my own work, just ignore and explicitly say that I'm ignoring usually. When I'm analyzing board games, I usually explicitly say that I'm looking at mechanics and I'm looking at setting, and I'm not looking at that. And I leave that to other people who want to do that, like survey type work, or the textual analysis of other people's descriptions informed by the mechanics. That would be my comment there.
Kate, I know you more do video gaming, but did you want to jump in on this too?
Well, I don't have anything particularly positive or helpful to add. Just because, I mean, like Hamish, I'm a little bit cautious of some. I mean, I have read and I'm aware of some really good work, particularly in relation to women's experiences with video games. For example, there's a couple of really good books in the last couple of years that have worked with female players playing different games and kind of got them to do exactly this kind of thing, write about their experiences playing, and then the researcher has kind of asked them questions, and they've had most of them have done through focus groups. So having a kind of controlled group of students effectively as your focus group is a way of kind of doing that. But I'm always a little bit cautious personally, because I feel like as classicists, we're not really trained to work with live subjects very much. And, I had this experience just recently. I was, one of the things I did for kind of my own work was interview a games writer, and I had to fill out an ethics application and it was the first ethics application anyone in classics in my department had ever done, because we never, I mean, now that kind of things like impact case studies in the UK, which is kind of encouraging us to reach out to communities and so on, are gaining speed, there is more of this work happening. But a lot of us work with people who've been dead so long that there's no chance of kind of any ethical problems, really. So we're really not used to doing this kind of work. And so I've always been a bit kind of cautious about this, which is not to say one shouldn't do it, but I think it would be really useful to sort of gain more experience from people, probably from people who work in kind of game studies proper. Actually would be the place I would personally go for this kind of thing, to talk to them about, how do they do it when they're working with modern audiences and so on.
Thank you both for that. That's really very, very insightful. And yeah, I didn't even think about having to fill out an ethics report or anything that's just a really fascinating thing that it took me off guard a little bit. We are getting loads and loads of questions here. So I'm going to start with this one from Amy Norgard. It's actually the next question, similar to the next question on my list too. She asks, to what extent are you cognizant or concerned about accessibility of gaming research to wider communities? It seems the academic monograph has its limitations in this case. What are some other ways to promote accessibility and publicizing gaming research to interested groups? Either of you want to jump on it, or should I nominate someone? Hamish, why don't you go ahead?
Okay, yeah. I mean, that's one of the reasons actually that I was really excited about the way that the call for papers for this conference came out. It was framed and was really encouraging kind of experimental takes on how you engage with games and games research. And it's certainly one of the things that I'm particularly interested in. And I'm glad that you brought that up, Amy. Thanks. Because we've had, what have I got on my list here? Something like 10, 11 talks on games at this conference, or gaming event things, of which most of them have been talks, but there's been 2 streams. There was an actual play thing from Chuck and his team. The different approaches that people have taken to how they present their research in those talks has been good, and we've seen a variety of how you incorporate gameplay into an academic talk to make it accessible to an academic audience who might not have seen the gameplay. But I think the realm of streams and online videos is a good way of engaging with non-academics in a semi-academic way. And I say semi-academic as an academic who does this with a stream that I would generously call semi-academic, right? Where I talk about games from my perspective as an ancient historian, but I'm not necessarily analyzing them in a way that I would in a paper or a talk, but I'm bringing that, I guess, theoretical background and that general way of thinking about games into them, and hopefully a way that that people who watch find accessible. So I think there's a lot of potential for that, and I think there's a lot of people doing that. And the SASA folks are certainly among them, and there's a bunch of people here as well who do that kind of streaming. Yeah, that would be my response to that. Do you have anything else, Kate?
Yeah, I would agree. I think, that particularly things like streaming or kind of podcasts and so on have been, I suppose, in what I would sort of consider outreach on games, have been a really nice, flourishing field. Recently in classics a bit, and obviously Hamish and the SASA folks and everyone are doing some of this, but even more in history, and things like the kind of well-established History Respawned series, for example, which I've done a few episodes of, and there are kind of other equivalent things where they look at sort of historical games and they have academics on talking about these, but for really the audience of gamers, because then this way we can take some of our research, beyond just other classicists. But in terms of kind of accessibility of games research, I wanted to raise something else actually that I was thinking of in relation to this, which I think it's worth us bearing in mind a little bit as we kind of go forward and do more research on games. And that's accessibility of the kind of things we're researching is a bit of an issue in games, and something we have to start thinking about, I think, because with a kind of TV series or a film, there is a bit of an outlay cost, but a TV series for many people is going to be free at some point, or they're going to have access to it through their institution or something like that. Many institutional libraries carry DVDs of films and so on, novels and so on. Fine, you can easily get those to your library. If a game costs £60 and you're trying to ask people to read it, to play it, I suppose, and understand it and to know what it's about and so on, but everyone is going to have to buy their own copy for £60, that is not accessible. In terms of, this is something which puts me off teaching with games a little bit, or at least is something we have to, I think, be very aware of if we're trying to do more teaching with games. But it's also something to bear in mind when we're researching these games, because we cannot be asking people to pay huge amounts of money to access the thing we're talking about. And so we really have to assume that our audiences are not going to have access to what is effectively our primary source in a way that they would if we were doing research onto other texts. And so that doesn't really kind of necessarily answer your question, but actually in terms of thinking about accessibility of research is something I wanted to raise, because I think it's quite, again, it's a sort of slightly unique aspect of doing work in this area, that as this area expands, I think we are going to have to pay a bit more attention to, probably.
Absolutely. This is something I've been wondering about for coming up to teaching, and I wanted to use games in the classroom, and you can't expect your students to spend, like you say, 60 quid on a game, let alone, the system they need to play it, let alone the 80 plus hours they then need to play the game. It's just, it's a huge resource commitment that is, Anyways, sorry. Hamish, did you want to jump in on this as well?
I just wanted to highlight the extra cost of the equipment as you just did, Natalie. And I think that's a really important thing as well. There's going to be a whole other panel on gaming pedagogy in a few hours. So definitely, if you're interested in that, you should all go check that out. That should be great as well. in terms of research, this is part of why I think making good use of things like YouTube or fan wikis is really useful, because if you are writing an article and you include and you don't say anything about how somebody might access the game without playing through the game to get to the point, oh, I mean, that's rough.
Yeah.
Fortunately, most games nowadays have names for quests, or many games have names for quests. So there is a way that you can attach a sort of citation to a particular moment, but that won't always be possible. So we have to think, and we have to be conscious of how we make sure that people can understand the thing that we're talking about, and not just have to take our word for it that this thing happens in the game, that here's a YouTube video, and if you go to the 27th minute or whatever, you'll find this, or here's a wiki where it describes what happens here. That sort of thing, that means that somebody can read your work, see what you're talking about, go look up the thing, know a little bit more, understand the context a bit better, and then come back to it without having to spend 200 hours in that intermediate phase playing through all of Assassin's Creed Odyssey or whatever to get to the obscure thing that you want to talk about the Medusa.
No, I think that's a really good point, to really make use of those resources available, not only in our research, but in sharing our research. I've been working on a paper on Horizon Zero Dawn, which is 80 plus hours, and citing individual conversations. Yeah, it's challenging because you can't just say, go play and hope that they have a copy of the game. Anyways, sorry, I'm going to jump to some of the questions because we are getting a bit of a backlog here. I really want to get to one of my own questions, so I may, use my host's privilege at some point. But first of all, Chris McLean asks, what frameworks of inquiry or theory have been most useful or you have most enjoyed in analyzing games? I was curious what or who you have found really helpful as theoretical apparatuses. They recently read Games Agency as Art, which has been very helpful for some of their work. Kate, do you want to start off on this one?
Yes, and I'm going to cheat by, this is the advantage of virtual things, because I'm just going to check someone's surname. Yeah, okay, excellent. So first, I mean, some of the things I've mentioned already as being kind of generally useful for reception studies more widely. I think reception theory is kind of a really useful brand of, I know that's a huge umbrella, but I think for doing this kind of work, that's a really good starting point. And personally, because I do a lot of work on gender, things like gender and feminist theory have been personally really useful. And those kind of, in that regard, I'm treating games to some extent as almost just another text in the reception studies version of text, i.e., they could absolutely be texts. More specifically, I think some of the very recent work coming out of historical games studies, and I'm thinking particularly here of work like that done by Adam Chapman, who has got a really good book, Digital Games as History, How Video Games Represent the Past and Offer Practice. Yeah, perfect. Hamish has just put it in the chat for you.
Thank you,
Chapman's kind of one of the, because he's got this whole monograph, one of the sort of, I would say, biggest sources of this approach, but it's found elsewhere as well. And I think this is somewhere where actually we can really usefully look to history and see, because they're 5 to 10 years ahead of us, really, in terms of thinking about questions like accuracy versus authenticity, what we're doing with games when we're looking at kind of history in games and games as history. So I would say, yeah, historical games theory, the sort of emerging field there, has been really useful for me.
Excellent, thank you, Kate. That's, yeah, we do have a lot of catching up to do in our discipline, certainly. Hamish, what about you?
Yeah, so Adam Chapman, obviously, that's why I was in the middle of writing that out when Kate referenced it. It was very good timing. I would also say the work of Esther Wright at Warwick on games, also in the historical game space, on paratexts in particular, is a really interesting way of thinking about the things that surround games and that we can use productively. That's one that I find useful. Our co-panelists who couldn't be with us today, Ross Clare, his new book, Ancient Greece and Roman Video Games. I have not finished reading it yet, but it gets into transmedia theory, and I found that really useful for thinking about. And Christian Rollinger's recent book, I forget what it's called, but look at historical game studies and look at the 2 recent classics books, because I think they have a lot of a lot of really cool stuff in them. I will try and dump all those links into the chat.
Thank you for that, Hamish. Yeah, I completely agree. The other thing that I just want to quickly note is that one thing that I have found particularly, I don't know if I would say useful, but really interesting, is the work in game studies that's being done on the avatar and gamer connection and how that actually functions. And so unfortunately, a lot of the work's in German, but there's two scholars that I found really useful, which are Rune Klevier and Britta Neitzel. Both of them have done some really interesting work on that bond. And I think, again, when we talk about reception of games where there is this direct player engagement in the gaming story world, it is something that needs to be taken into account to some degree. So thank you, everybody, for that. I do have a couple other questions. I'm going to ask this one from Leslie, and it will bridge nicely into the one that I want to ask. So Leslie Wong asks, how do you distinguish between the positions or ideologies that a game itself is more or less explicitly expressing and those that the players, including yourselves, read into it? Is there even a point in doing so? Very interesting question, I think. Hamish, do you want to start on this one?
Could you repeat the question, please? Sorry.
I'm sorry. You were busy. You're busy doing links. I'm so sorry about that. Okay.
That's fine. That's fine.
How do you distinguish between the positions or ideologies that a game itself is more or less explicitly expressing and those that the players, including yourselves, read into it? Is there even a point in doing so?
I mean, I think the same way that you do in, well, I mean, I guess it's a little bit different because of the interactivity, but essentially I would think the same way as that you do with a TV show or any text, really. A text has a position that we are trying to find out, right? But we're always bringing our own position to it. And that's just as true for games as it is for Livy or Suetonius or Strabo or Greek people. Yeah, sorry, that's my take on that.
No, that's great. Sorry, I was just scrolling through all of the wonderful links you put up. Yeah, no, I think you're right. There is a lot of similarity there. Kate, do you want to jump in on this too?
Yeah, I mean, I absolutely agree with Hamish that I think a lot of this is kind of the same, almost the same answer as what we do with any other text. And, you know, to some extent, those of us who are sort of postmodernist theorists, I suppose, would say, well, it doesn't matter what position the game itself has got because, you know, reader response theory, we are the only people who matter here. I'm not saying I would go that far. I'm just saying, you know, you can take that option if that's the theoretical position you wish to adopt. Having said that, I think one thing that is a bit different is that we do have access to a lot more of things like what the game designers were thinking and what their intentions were than we do with something like a play of Sophocles, because they do things like interviews for promotion, and, you know, indeed we can contact them ourselves and sometimes do, and we can ask, okay, but why did you do this? What was the intention? What did you want the audience to get out of this particular scene? And that does open aside. That doesn't mean we necessarily need to accept the kind of author's view of the position of the text, because we can still think that texts have their own positions beyond what the author intended. But it is a kind of new way of accessing some of this material which we don't have for ancient texts. And I would say to some extent, you know, how do we distinguish between those things? One of the things we have to do probably is pay attention to that existing body of knowledge or kind of body of material by looking at interviews with creators and so on. And if we don't want to do that, then again, for me, it's about being explicit about the fact that we're not necessarily interested in what the game designer was intending, you know, for this particular study, for this particular article. That isn't going to be our focus here. We are more interested in audience responses regardless of intention, or for this other study, we are going to pay attention to these interviews. I think, you know, as with many things, it's sometimes just about being explicit about our approach, but being aware that there is much more access to this information for games than for other types of text, and that could be useful to us.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great point. I mean, so many, especially indie game developers, are open to having these conversations where people who make films are not necessarily as open to having that academic discourse. And so I think that is a resource that definitely can be taken advantage of if people want to. And I mean that in a positive sense, can be used for scholarship. Okay, I'm going to use that to bridge into one of my questions. So this is probably mostly for Kate, because I know you do your current project is on women in gaming and women in classical games in particular. And of course, I think most people here are aware of Gamergate, unfortunately, which was, well, is, I guess, a movement to force primarily women and non-white men and non-heterosexual men out of gaming and silence those voices, to put it bluntly. So I was just wondering, how has the Gamergate movement impacted your research at all? And of course, this goes for you as well, Hamish, but I'm just going to start with Kate because I know you do gender-based work. How has your research been impacted by Gamergate, and how do you see this ongoing right-wing movement affecting research in the medium, not just in classics, but in general? Sorry if that's a very broad question.
Yeah, it is, but it's a good question. Yes, obviously this is something I'm particularly interested in, and indeed I see one of our contributors, hi Amy, for the same project is here as well. So this is an interest which I know some of the audience share, and it is really important, and particularly because all of this, Gamergate, but also all of the things we've been seeing coming out of game studios recently in relation to pay discrimination, sexual harassment, and so on. These are all the immediate context of the things we're studying here. And so to sort of pretend none of this exists, I think in my view, would be a mistake. And so it's impacted my research in terms of, encouraging me to think about these things within that context. I also think sort of to some extent in classics, we have a double problem here because things like Gamergate were about, games not being for women to some extent, and, games not some subsections of the gaming community, particularly the ones who identify themselves as gamers rather than just players of games, really wanting to say that women shouldn't necessarily even be represented in games, and to do otherwise is kind of politically correct. And then if you look at ancient world video games, this gets even stronger because people have preconceptions about the ancient world, which also include that there were no women, doing anything in the ancient world, which may or may not be true to a, given extent, depending on what you're looking at in the ancient world. So there are kind of, I suppose, double negative factors here that, to my mind, actually act as a stimulus for this research that I think make, therefore, researching these things, these audience attitudes to women, player attitudes to women, game studios attitudes to women, are sort of doubly important. But so that's really sort of personally the impact it's had on me has made me even more determined to be doing this work, to interrogating these ideas and kind of bringing to light some of the preconceptions that are going into this on behalf of the studios, on behalf of the players and so on, and making sure that we're not just kind of leaving this to one side and saying, well, that doesn't really have anything to do with us. Because I think because some of these attitudes are intensified by attitudes or ideas about the ancient world, this absolutely does have something to do with us as classicists, as well as having something to do with us as people who are interested in games. So I'm afraid that's a bit of a rambling answer, but it was quite a big question, and hopefully that if the questioner or if you want to kind of follow up, I'd be very happy to.
I think that's
a
great answer. I mean, I think it is. I think that's a great answer. It's always going to be relevant, especially in our research now. And I think branching off from that, the other thing that, I mean, we are three white people discussing this. We need to consider also issues of racism in gaming and the desperate underrepresentation of BIPOC people in certainly AAA titles, if not in the genre in general. Pardon me, the medium in general. But yeah, Hamish, did you want to respond, and then we can ask some more specific questions?
I don't think I have anything in particular to add to what Kate said. I think Kate put it perfectly. I don't think there's much difference between the way that we have to deal with this as scholars in gaming and the way that we have to deal with this as classicists generally. I think the problems are very similar. Yeah.
Absolutely. And I think that one thing that, Kate, I think you may have alluded to a little bit as well, is because classics, or the study of the ancient Mediterranean world, does have this very troubled and troubling history in terms of its complicity with colonialism, its use by so many right-wing organizations. It makes it especially important for us to push back in our research of representations of the ancient world. I don't have a good follow-up question. Your answer was really great, Kate. Did you want to say anything else before we move on, or?
Well, actually, I'd like to pick up on the point that you made about kind of the question of race as well being really important here, because I think one of the things that I would like to see kind of moving forward in games research is we are now starting to do gender, but you know, that's partly because of Jane and I deciding to do this volume on gender. So you know, we wanted to do this quickly. We did not want the development of kind of classics in classical game studies to be like the development of classics, where we spend the first period of the study just talking about men in games and not bringing in the gender aspect of it. But kind of, so that's why we kind of got on with it, really. We thought there was a gap and it needed to be filled immediately. But the same is true of these questions of race and these questions of colonialism in gaming and so on, which they are again starting to tackle in historical game studies quite well now. I know there's another special issue coming in the journal Gaming and Culture, Games and Culture, I think it is actually, which some people at this panel might be interested in, where they're looking at war and trauma and the representation of these in historical games that will lend itself really nicely to some of these approaches. But this is something I feel like we need to be doing in classical game studies as well, is remembering that the field of classics has modernized, at least is modernizing, despite all this problematic history, and not just reproducing our problematic history as a discipline within this new subfield, but bringing these modern approaches to it now rather than sort of waiting for them to happen later. Is something I feel is really important. So I'm really glad you brought up that kind of question of race and colonialism, because I also think it's something we need to be addressing in our work at the moment.
And I agree. I think and I think one thing is also that, because I mean, what you were saying earlier, so many game developers are interested in dialogue with players, including academics. Our research can in fact push the medium as well, where, I mean, one thing that I was quite disturbed to find in my research on Horizon Zero Dawn was that Sony insisted on doing a playtest survey of male gamers to see how uncomfortable they were playing a female avatar. And I mean, that's freaking ridiculous in 2021. And if we can again just push the narrative beyond that really backward position. Anyways, I'm sorry. So that was just, my little thought on that. I know, I'm sorry, Alexander, we're not gonna be able to get to your last question because we just have 5 minutes left. And there was one question that Roger actually asked before we began admitting people that I think I want to just bring up again, because I know that there are a number of people in the audience here today who aren't gamers, but who may be interested in becoming a gamer, or at least exploring gaming in your scholarship and teaching. So I just wanted to ask you two, what would you say to scholars interested in gaming but nervous about coming to such a vast and diverse medium? And as Roger specifically asked, how would you recommend someone new to the medium get started? I realize you did sort of answer this to him personally, but I just thought it would be worth speaking to the whole audience. Hamish, do you want to get started on this one?
Yeah, sure. And while I do that, Kate, did you see the? Oh no, you're on it. Good. Okay.
Opportunity to advertise. Absolutely, I'm on it.
Absolutely. I'm super excited about Kate's forthcoming volume. It's great. It's great that the third volume to be published on classics and games is specifically about gender, so early in the cycle. So in response to that question, when Roger asked a similar version in our pre-chat, I said that the Forgotten City was a great way in terms of like a single game that's good, because it's quick and it doesn't require a lot of gamer skills. Like, you don't have to be good at the micro or like have good twitch reflexes or any of those things that people often associate with that. But I would say that nowadays many games have modes of play that are extremely accessible to people who are not necessarily expert at games. And so it is easier than ever before to get into games from that perspective. Of course, there are still the limitations that we already discussed about cost of equipment and cost of games and all that stuff. But I would say that if there is a game you are interested in, then just give it a go. Especially if it was published in the last 5 years, it probably has a story mode, which is like the easiest mode. And anybody who says that you're not doing it right by playing it on the easy mode is wrong, and you can just discount their opinion, right? All the modes are valid. The great value of story modes is that it lets you see the story, as the name would would suggest very quickly. And so you still experience the mechanics. It might not be as hard, but who cares? That's not what we're necessarily here for when we're studying these games. You can still see what the game is doing, how the game's mechanics are working, what ideologies are being put forth by the game. Julie brought up a good point that was sort of implicit in what we were talking about, and is implicit in most of the work that goes on in historical games, about how games take political stances, and that is just self-evidently true. As texts take political stances, we all sort of know that, but worth highlighting specifically. And you can see all of that through doing a very easy mode of a game, and you'll get a sense of it, and you might decide, actually, this is not for me. But you might decide, oh, I like this, and maybe next time I'll turn the difficulty up, or maybe I'll get into these other games, or I played this and now I want to know more about other games in the genre. But I would say just pick something that you're interested in, and give it a go on whatever difficulty level you're comfortable with, and see where it goes from there.
Yeah, that's a great answer. Absolutely. Just find something that appeals to you and try it is really the best way to start anything. But that was a great answer. Kate, do you have anything you wanted to add?
Yeah, I mean, I would absolutely agree with that. And I think it's kind of worth remembering that, you know, particularly in historical games research, there is a tendency to kind of look at some types of games. So strategy games or kind of often shooter games or so on have a lot of prominence, but that doesn't mean those are the only games out there. So being aware that there's loads of different things you could be looking at. So if you think you might prefer puzzle games or, you know, city builders or things with no strategy at all, you know, representations of the ancient world in The Sims or something, you know, all of these are perfectly valid forms of games. And I would like to push mobile gaming as well. Indeed, am pushing mobile gaming as kind of also a valid form of gaming that deserves research. So easy things, yes. Things of different genres, yes. There are loads of different ways to get involved. But in terms of kind of studying this as a field, as well as in thinking about this as kind of an academic area you might want to get into, I think it's worth saying that we don't necessarily have to be expecting all our researchers to be playing games. Now, this is going to be kind of more or less easy depending on what you're trying to research. But, you know, we've already talked quite a lot about the value of things like let's play streams on YouTube where someone else is playing the game and you can just watch it, or, you know, reading the script on wikis and this kind of thing. We wouldn't necessarily expecting people who are doing work on theatre to be actors, and I think it's perfectly okay. It's going to be different, and I think, you know, authors and researchers should be honest about the fact that they are not coming at this as a player themselves versus someone who is coming at it as a player. But I think we can absolutely be doing research on these things as texts that we look at from a distance. It doesn't always necessarily have to be about playing. So I think there's absolutely ways for people to get involved in this, even if they don't want to play the games, they just want to sort of study them from a distance. That seems to me to be fine as well, and I think we should encourage it, really.
I think that's such an excellent point. You're absolutely right. I love that. Sorry, I love that analogy that people who study theater aren't necessarily actors. You've hit it on the head. And what I just want to, sorry, I know we're 1 minute over, but I just want to repeat something that's going on in the chat, which is regarding board games and tabletop gaming. They are, I can reiterate what Hamish says, they are very easy to get into. I only started playing D&D 3 years ago, and I'm now in 2 weekly campaigns. So once you find a community, people, because these interests are fairly niche, you may find toxic individuals, but a lot of people are very happy to help you learn from my experience. So Roger, just go hang out with Chuck some more. So that really draws our roundtable to an end. I just want to give us all the opportunity to thank Hamish and Kate once again for coming here and discussing this. Thank you so much for this wonderful, wonderful discussion. I wish we had more time because I have more questions. There were more questions from the audience.